Thank you for that ridiculously over-the-top but much appreciated introduction. I'm a huge admirer of Janet's, and not only was I a huge admirer of John Chafee's, but in perhaps typical Rhode Island fashion, my father and John Chafee were college roommates when they came back from World War II, having both served as Marines in the Pacific. So be careful what you say about people in Rhode Island, because there's at most 2 degrees of separation. I also want to recognize Chris Spaulding, who did such a good job as our Region 1 administrator for EPA. And what I would like to do is to take you through a couple of slides about a particular issue, and then we can open it up to conversation about any topic at all that you wish to raise. But I did want to take you through these slides because for a long time we have seen climate change as a predicted problem and as an environmental problem. Both of those are changing. Predictions are turning into experiences, and the environmental problem that is looming is now having very strongly predicted economic effects and warnings. So I want to take you through those, not just to scare you, but also to give you the tool in your rhetorical toolbox for conversations about climate change. So let me see if I can get to the slides. There we go. Economic risks of climate change. We know that there are innumerable different effects from climate change. This slide just shows some of the differences between holding it at 1.5 degrees and holding it at 2 degrees, but younger folks, this is going to be the thing.
Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Storm surge and fires burn, but you don't hear the call. 'Cause fossil fuels keep paying you. Does it weigh on you at all? Does it weigh on you at all? Does it weigh on you at all? This is a climate emergency, and we aren't acting like it. You aren't acting like it. This event is supposed to tackle the issue of climate change in the region, but the event is being hosted by Fidelity Investments, who has put $94 billion into fossil fuels and is an organization that National Grid is a member of. Senator Whitehouse, as long as you don't sign the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, you should not be given a platform as a climate leader. It's clear that you've chosen corporations over the people in our survival, and it's disgusting that you have the audacity to do that. And so what we need is bold and urgent action, and instead we're here at this event. We're celebrating the incremental successes of the corporations that are profiting most from this crisis. And so we need you to finally step up and support the Green New Deal and sign the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge. We gonna rise up till it's won. We gonna rise up till it's won. When people rise up, the power comes down.
Well, there's an example of the next generation taking this damn seriously. So I think that's actually kind of appropriate for this moment. Just to clarify, not only do I not take fossil fuel money, I don't take corporate money.
How come they didn't know
the
that?
history of this is pretty obvious. This has been caused by an explosion of carbon emissions since the industrial era. And what people understand less is that the oceans have had an enormous part in protecting us. More than 93% of the excess heat that has been captured by all those carbon emissions has gone into the oceans. And of course, with Rhode Island as the ocean state and with our coasts, such an important part of our economy, this brings some real problems home to roost. The metric that I like to use when I'm talking about the heat that the oceans are absorbing is that in recent decades, the rate of heat absorption by the oceans from climate change is equivalent to 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons being detonated in the sea and having the sea capture all of that energy as heat energy every single second. Wow. Think about that. 4 Hiroshima explosions every single second, all of that heat dissipating into the ocean. So we've been lucky, but it sure has changed the oceans. This is Rhode Island. This is the upper bay. You see Providence at the top. You see Warwick Neck and Greenwich Bay down to the left. Bristol and Warren down to the right. And we are predicting now, based on both the expanding oceans because of the heat, water warms when it expands, and because of melting glaciers, 9 to 12 feet of sea level rise in a do-nothing scenario, according to CRMC. So this is what Rhode Island looks like with 10 feet of sea level rise. We go from being our familiar green state to being an archipelago of new islands, including Bristol Island, Warwick Neck Island, and others. And if you look at everything that's blue there, there's a lot that's valuable. I'll call your attention particularly to Barrington, which becomes the Barrington Salt Lake, basically. So this has real consequences for us. If you look at downtown Providence, this is at 5 feet of sea level rise, 7 feet of sea level rise, and this is that same 10 feet of sea level rise. So a lot's going to have to change in downtown Providence if we don't head this off. Here's another view of the various buildings. You'll notice front and center, City Hall. Here's another view. You take the gondolas, go right to the top of the City Hall steps. So this is going to have a very big impact on us. This is the coast of Warren, Rhode Island, and the maroon buildings you see towards the top, above the red ones and below the yellow ones. Those are the Warren sewage treatment facility buildings, and Warren is already planning to have to move those elsewhere because of this threat to flooding. This is 2 feet of sea level rise, plus a 100-year storm, with 100-year storms happening about every 5 to 10 years now. So they're very serious about it. They're having to move it. Narragansett already had to dike its sewage treatment plant. Because of gravity flow, there's a lot of sewage treatment infrastructure that is very much imperiled. And also a lot of our historic infrastructure is pretty imperiled. So this isn't just a matter of flooding, because before you actually get to the flooding, this problem comes into financing, and it comes into insuring. And these are all groups that have made warnings about economic crash threats related to sea level rise. There are primarily 2, and for a while I'm just going to focus on the first one, which is coastal property values crashing. The second is a carbon asset bubble, crashing the fossil fuel industry's value, and with it taking down much of the larger economy. But let's start for a minute with the coastal property value crash that Freddie Mac and Zillow and the Union of Concerned Scientists and Moody's and First Street and others have warned about. Zillow puts the number 4,800 homes in Rhode Island, worth about $3 billion, lost by 2,100 to 6 feet of sea level rise. Interesting, if you look at that map of where we expect the flooding to be, in the earlier one, they're seeing actually more growth in Rhode Island in the flooded, to-be-flooded portions than not. So our risks are growing. And the Union of Concerned Scientists has estimated in a comprehensive study that it did that sea level rise would double the number of coastal communities facing chronic inundations and possible retreat by 2035, which is why Moody's has now warned that it's going to start valuing and rating municipal bonds of coastal communities based on their exposure to this risk. We just had a hearing in Washington on this, and the mayor of Honolulu was there and said that his bond rating agency is already in, challenging him about what the response is going to be and what the costs are going to be. First Street Foundation started with a peer-reviewed study in Florida and went all the way up the coast. They're through Maine now. This is the image from the Providence Journal front page story on their report. Rhode Island coastal properties lost nearly $45 million in expected value already. If you chart where coastal property values should be, if you sync them in with inland property values, and then you adjust downward for the discrepancy that you see in actual property values, the difference is $45 million. The difference in Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island together is more than $400 million. The difference along the entire East Coast is $15 billion already lost. So if there were going to be a coastal property value crash, the first part you would see would be values starting to separate along the coast and tail off a little bit before it plunged. And we are seeing that already happening. First Street Foundation says, each time we analyze a new state, we see the same phenomenon. Increased tidal flooding leads to a loss in home value appreciation. As sea level rise accelerates, we expect the corresponding loss in relative home value to accelerate as well. Coastal homes may become insurable. This is the big reinsurance titan Swiss Re. Coastal flooding will clearly become a bigger issue in the long term. We can offer protection for hurricane losses or flood losses or other perils, but if certain coastal areas are so exposed, insurance becomes no longer viable. It becomes even uninsurable. And here's Freddie Mac predicting that the economic losses and social disruption of coastal property value crash may happen gradually, but they are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. So for those of us who just lived through the 2008 crash and Great Recession, we've got a real problem on our hands. And of course, this happens way before the water hits your doorstep. This happens when the next buyer of coastal property can't get insurance or can't get a mortgage. So it's got about a 30-year lead on it. And when you can't sell your property except to a cash buyer who is anticipating that the property may not last very long, the value of that property collapses. That's the concern. There's a publication called Risk and Insurance. It's an industry publication that says that describes the growing and alarming threat that continually rising seas will damage coastal, residential, and commercial property values to the point that property owners will flee those markets in droves, thus precipitating a mortgage value collapse that could equal or exceed the mortgage crisis that rocked the global economy in 2008. On the housing crisis of 2008, they go on to say that a significant percentage of borrowers in 2008 hung on and made their mortgage payments even though the value of their homes was less than the mortgage. There was sentimental value, there was nuisance value. They stayed and they paid, and when the economy recovered, the banks and the economy were not as disrupted. To quote Risk and Insurance, it is less likely that borrowers will continue to make mortgage payments if their homes are literally underwater. The world's largest asset management company is BlackRock. It describes how investors are now underpricing the impact of climate-related risks and need to rethink their assessment of asset vulnerabilities. The physical manifestations of climate change are clear, including rising sea levels and more intense hurricanes, wildfires, and droughts. How investors incorporate these risks into their analysis has not reflected this risk. And if you take a look, you see the highest risk places. You can obviously expect Florida. But look up there. Our Cape Cod. So that's right home in New England. It's the highest risk place. The last thing I'll mention is the carbon bubble and the problem of stranded assets. There is an enormous amount of economic, professional work and analysis being done on this problem right now. It is serious enough that 30 sovereign banks around the country, around the world, led by the Bank of England, Bank of France, Bank of Canada, have all required much better reporting and warned about this hazard. There wasn't much done in the last COP, but one thing that was done is $32 trillion worth of private investment got together to demand better reporting of this carbon asset bubble risk. That number is about up to $80 trillion now as other big firms have joined. So some very serious people who are not environmentalists are looking at this as a very, very dangerous problem. The Bank of England describes it as what they call a systemic risk. Systemic risk is the most boring and bland, terrifying term in the English language, because what it means is that when things collapse, it's such a sharp collapse that it goes beyond the affected industry. In the same way that the 2008 economic meltdown went beyond the mortgage companies that had the crappy mortgages, this will go well beyond the fossil fuel industry. And the estimates at this point are that there's $12 trillion in excess overstated value on the books of those companies right now. And that a carbon bubble collapse would wipe out 82% of global coal reserves, 49% of global gas reserves, and 33% of global oil reserves. And of course, all of the economy that supports that industry is going to be dragged down with it. So, while it's important for a lot of reasons to have that not happen, one of the strong signals that's coming at us is this threat of specific economic crashes associated with climate change. And nothing says that the coastal property value crash and the carbon asset bubble crash can't both happen. So we really, I think, have a whole lot of new allies beginning to emerge as Wall Street, finance companies, realtors, coastal banks, and others begin to recognize the scope of this problem, which is why I take this slideshow around and show it to as many people as I can, because frankly, we need allies in the fight in Congress right now, particularly from the corporate community, which has been spectacularly AWOL on this issue throughout. So thanks very much, and happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
So can we take a few questions?
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions for the senator? I know you're all shy. It takes a while. Go ahead. Okay.
I'll come around with the mic. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Senator Whitehouse. Thanks for being here this morning. My name is Bernd Giels, and I've worked primarily with NOAA and the National Marine Sanctuary System before. And the question I want to ask you is regarding the carbon tax concept. I've done some research on the issue, and talking about the carbon bubble, I think the question is timely. So if we could actually set a price on carbon today per ton, I'm curious what research you've seen, like what do you think would be a realistic price to set if we could immediately do that now?
There's been a fair amount of research on that. My bill is about $52+ per ton right now, and it has a pretty good accelerator on it. It has inflation plus 6%, unless and until we know that we're ahead of the problem. It would be very, very effective at reducing carbon emissions. The Brookings Institute did a survey recently of a bunch of economic analyses of carbon prices, and it does seem to show that you above $25 is more powerful. $50 seems to be a good place. It also happens to coincide with where the Obama administration's social cost of carbon was, which is kind of the reverse side of the same equation. So that's where I am. Some of the bills have come in a little bit lower on the House side, but they've had bigger accelerators. So I think there's a general agreement that $25 to $50 is probably the range, and to play it safe, you should be at the top of that range. And it's pretty widespread. The other thing that's good, there are several things that are good about pricing carbon. One, it minimizes political wrangling, because every single Republican who has thought this problem through to a solution virtually entirely have come to the same one, which is a price on carbon that's revenue neutral and border adjustable. Second, it's rateable. If you're not doing well, you can simply dial it up, and if you are doing well, you can simply dial it back. Third, it creates enormous revenues that you can use to help affected communities, to invest further in green energy, to address whatever. It doesn't matter much, according to Brookings, where you spend that money in terms of solving the problem. It's the pricing that does it. So that gives a lot of political flexibility to get to solving the problem, which I think is important. And then from the point of view of border adjustment, it's very easy to compare two countries' carbon price, whereas it's very complicated to compare two countries' regulatory regimes and see, for trade purposes, you know, who's cheating whom on carbon emissions. So I'm a big fan of it. I frankly don't think that there is a climate bill that will succeed at the task we have of 1.5 degrees that does not include a significant carbon price. I think it is a essential, necessary, if not sufficient, element of any bill.
Senator, can I ask you a question about optimism? Are you optimistic? Are we going to be able to sort of deal with this?
Yeah, I actually am optimistic. I mean, it's been a long, bleak time. Those 250 speeches have not been a whole lot of fun. It's a chronicle of failure. It's a chronicle of corruption. It's a chronicle of blindness. It's a chronicle of venality. It's just a very unfortunate decade that we lost. But we lost that decade to politics. And we lost it for fairly specific reasons. In 07 and 08 and 09, when I was a new senator, there were bipartisan climate bills all over the place. It stopped dead in 2010 when the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court gave the fossil fuel industry unprecedented new political weaponry to muscle Congress with. And the fossil fuel industry took about 2 seconds to figure out how to hide that it was the fossil fuel industry through screening groups of various kinds. And the threats and the bluster and the promises and the muscle and all of that stopped us dead. So we lost a decade. It was a very unfortunate loss and perhaps a critical one. But it's starting to emerge. Things are starting to break up. I see it in the way my colleagues deal with this. I just went through the Arctic with John Barrasso of Wyoming, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and Lisa Murkowski, the Republican chair of the Energy Committee. Every country we went to, they got nothing but climate, climate, climate. And they knew perfectly well going into the trip that they were going to get nothing but climate, climate, climate. So they're listening and they're trying to get there. The fossil fuel industry, I think, is feeling a twinge of embarrassment about how wicked it is. And at least at the CEO level, to get through cocktail parties at Davos, they're pretending that they think climate change is real and they should do something about it. I'll take the pretense as a signal that they feel some real pressure. That's not a bad sign. And then you've got these industries that for the first time, finance, real estate, in these areas that are starting to say, wait a minute, this isn't just about looking nice to our customers. This isn't just about shareholder management. This is a potential risk to our business plan. And for a lot of these guys, particularly in the financial community who just lived through the 2008 meltdown, they're taking this very seriously. They're slow to move. They've got other things that they want in politics, so this is not a high priority, but it is getting there. It is getting there. And with any luck, we can crack the back of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, who are the two worst climate obstructors and have no business being the two worst climate obstructors, because they represent a whole lot of businesses who are on the other side of the argument. They've been kind of captured in-house, and there's a fight happening in-house to try to capture them back, and we're trying to put as much pressure on them as we can to accelerate the end of that fight. So this mess accrued over quite a long period of time, but to use a New England example, you know, the snow on your roof builds up snowflake by snowflake and snowstorm by snowstorm, but come spring, when it comes off the roof, it comes off with one big whoomph. And I think we can expect one big whoomph when it comes to the breakthrough that lets us solve this, and it could be very soon.
Question over here.
You circled a lot of things right there real quick regarding the question I was going to ask. But I also want to thank you for being our 250 presentations, good or bad. But the
Bittersweet.
yeah, but one of the things is the discussion of flood events and everything else, the new revising of FEMA maps and so on. Is there going to be any revamping of the insurance program? I mean, you tend to see these rebuilds again and again and again on some of these properties.
It's being worked on right now. It's a little bit bollocksed up in the Senate. The House passed a bill that I think was quite weak, but at least it has passed a bill, and we now need to pass something. We bought a little bit more time with a short extension, and we're still talking about that every minute. I think the what do you call it? Constantly being flooded properties are an issue we really need to address. At the moment, the rules about having to build back in site create that risk. And if you're a homeowner, you don't have the chance to choose to get out unless your municipality has made the choice to abandon, which is a very hard choice for municipalities to make. So what I'm trying to get into it is a choice by the homeowner that would allow them to get their payment from FEMA and leave, and then figure out the structure so that that property then becomes under some form of easement, so somebody else doesn't just come in and, you know, buy into the liability. So actively being worked on. Thank you all for giving me the time this morning. I really appreciate it. Thank you for